Hey there, and welcome back to yet another ranking of the Amigas, worst to best. And we're getting down to the nitty gritty now. We're into the top three. And once again, I'll remind you, please look in the video description. I explain the ranking of these systems in there, but very briefly, it's based on partially what the machine was at the time of launch, but also whether I'd recommend you buying one these days compared to all the options that you have out there. So yeah, go and check that out. I've explained it in a little bit more depth in other videos, but I just want to get straight on with this one. So, what do we have in at number 3? Well, its time has finally come. It is the Amiga 4000. So yes, we've got to the last main series of big box, that's like PC style desktop and tower case Amigas. From here on out, we're down to those that were all in one units, like, well, we'll find out. But yes, the Amiga 4000 was originally launched in September of 1992 by Commodore, and initially was only available in a desktop case style unit, very much styled after their sort of PC offerings of the time, although slightly different. And then later, just before Commodore went bankrupt, they produced around about 200 is the number that's bandied about, tower versions of the systems. You know, big hulking, huge tower system, very much in the style, well, not so much style, but the size of the Amiga 3000T. And this was then picked up by the succeeding company Amiga Technologies in 1995 and put into slightly greater production numbers, not vast amounts, and it was continued to be produced for a number of years actually, and I'll go into who by and why in this video. So, what is the Amiga 4000? Well, initially it was this. This is a desktop case variant. So there are two main variants of the Amiga 4000 in desktop case form factor. You had one with the 68040 processor. That was the initially offered configuration, which provided obviously quite a marked improvement over the base Amiga 3000 desktop case machine, running at 25 megahertz. And then a little bit later on, around about mid-1993, a 68030 version also clocked at 25 megahertz, so comparable to the top configuration of the Amiga 3000 desktop unit. So that's the two main configurations of the desktop Amiga 4000. I'll go into the 4000 tower in a little bit and I'll show you that on screen in due course. The Amiga 4000 was Commodore's first AGA Amiga, so that's Advanced Graphics Architecture. This meant, at long last, the Amiga was capable of displaying 256 colours, not in hand mode, but 256 colours in any screen mode that the Amiga could produce. That included your high resolution interlay screens, your low resolution screens, everything. So that was obviously a much needed upgrade, because by 1992 the Amiga's graphics capabilities were beginning to get quite long in the tooth. So very much a welcome upgrade. But beyond that, there aren't a vast amount of differences in AGA. For example, the sound capabilities are exactly the same as the Amiga 1000 from 1985, running with Paula. There are some slight speed ups because the Lisa chip is actually a proper 32-bit chip. But unfortunately, Alice, which is essentially the replacement for Agnes, is sort of a bit of a 16-bit design, so that somewhat hampers the speed of AGA as a whole. But there you have it. Otherwise, floppy disk access speeds are just the same. You've got Zorro 3 carried over from the Amiga 3000 architecture. Slight improvements, such as, for example, having RAM upgradable in 72-pin SIMs up to 16 megabytes of fast RAM on the motherboard or the desktop unit, which was a lot easier to upgrade than the zip RAM on the desktop Amiga 3000 and also 3000 Tower. So, plus points for that. Also 2 megabytes of chip RAM as standard, which was very much a necessity, I think, when we're dealing with AGA and its 256 colour screens. Beyond that, you know, the actual upgrades begin to become quite sparse. Most units, I think all desktop Amiga 4000s came with high-density floppy drives, unfortunately running at half speed because we're still dealing with the original Paula chip, which couldn't handle full-speed high-density disk drive access. However, we do have some downgrades, and I want to take you back a little bit before the Amiga 4000 was launched to somewhat explain why the Amiga 4000 had some downgrades. Namely, it dropped the SCSI interface for hard disks and peripherals in general, for IDE, and a rather slow and basic IDE implementation at that. And other things such as losing the flicker fixer, which to some extent was mitigated by AGA's capabilities, but we'll touch upon that. So, back in late 1989, thereabouts, Commodore started the so-called Pandora project, and Pandora was a mild upgrade to Amiga's OCS/ECS chipset. The year before, in '88, Commodore had started the AAA project, the Advanced Amiga Architecture, something a bit different, but the AGA was meant to be a bit of a stopgap, quick solution to get 256 colour screens onto the Amiga. And this project slowly rumbled on, and a few projects were started in Commodore in sort of 1990, late 1990. The first one being the Amiga 3000 Plus. This was an AGA Amiga 3000 design. Had a few other extras such as a DSP chip for better audio capability, potentially built-in modem capability, and so forth. And there was another nifty little project called the Amiga 1000 Plus. We don't know whether it would have actually have come out with that name, but that was meant to be a little pizza box, very Macintosh LC inspired Amiga, with AGA, maybe a Zorro 2 slot or something like that, but a very nice compact pizza box, as it was called, style desktop case, and you would have also had like an O20 or an O30 processor in it, and it was meant to be, you know, sub $1,000 or so. So a really nice Amiga system. Imagine that coming out in 1991. Very nice. However, both these projects got the kibosh put on them when the engineering department at Commodore and in the Amiga division went through a number of changes, and my favourite guy amongst many at Commodore, Bill Sidneys, came in. An ex-IBM guy, was partially involved in the original IBM PC design back in the Project Chess, which was to become the IBM PC 5150, and then most famously the IBM PC Junior. Not a very well liked guy when you talk to many of the Commodore Amiga engineers and alumni that are still sort of around and so forth. But he came along and stopped work on a number of projects that we don't really have a definitive reason why. Maybe they were costing too much. Maybe Bill had been tasked with cutting costs and, you know, doing this typical management swagger thing. Said, yeah, I'll cut the costs and all the rest of it. Saw the Amiga 3000 Plus project, perhaps the Amiga 1000 Plus projects, and cancelled them and put together some projects that would be a lot cheaper. So sadly, we lost out on two particularly good machines. So Pandora kind of stalled. Pandora being what AJ would become, just to remind you. So what did we get instead? Well, Commodore started working on another ECS-based Amiga, probably to replace the aging Amiga 2000, cost reduction and so forth. And these were tentatively called the Amiga 2200 and the Amiga 2400. The designations represent whether the 2-slot Zorro 2 machine or the 4-slot Zorro 2 machine. So you would see there's some retrograde steps being made here. It's still ECS, it's not AGA or Pandora. It's using Zorro 2, not Zorro 3. And yeah, I mean, it's why are we spending all this money developing it? And you know, these machines were actually finished and were marketed to the various Commodore companies around the world. You know, we've got the new Amiga 2200, 2400. You know, would you like to order them, put them into production, all this kind of stuff? And none of the Commodore companies around the world would order them because it just even they knew that these were not going to sell. The market needed, you know, a big step up in terms of graphics capabilities, sound capabilities, all these kinds of things. And so this is when the panic sets in. And out there are a few Amiga 2200 motherboards. I believe that Doug of 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast, link in the video description, has one of these boards. And, you know, some of them are fully working. They resemble very much an Amiga 4000 motherboard. And that's exactly what happened. Commodore panicked, so what did they do? They started another project. This time the prototypes were called the Amiga 3200 and 3400, just basically taking on the nomenclature of the 2200 and 2400 project. Same thing, 2 slots, 4 slots, but this time with AGA, Pandora. So Pandora was rushed towards being completed, and prototypes were sent out. I've never actually personally seen any existence of an Amiga 3200 in desktop case prototype out there. I've seen various processor cards and so forth which have a 3200 silk screened onto them, but certainly there are examples of the Amiga 3400 prototypes out there, both in like the sort of pearly white or beige colour of the Amiga 4000 as it eventually became, and also black. And what it kind of looks like, it looks like they took one of their 386 PC cases and then bolted the faceplate that would have potentially become the Amiga 1000 Plus to the top of it, creating essentially a design with 2 3.5-inch bays, but the top bay, which the floppy drive, the factory installed floppy drive was sort of stylized. There are some pictures out there, and if I can't put them in the video due to copyright, have a look in the video description. I'll make sure all the links are there. And these all went out, and really they are an Amiga 4000. They're the prototypes of what would become the Amiga 4000. You know, some of them obviously had the cheapest 040 card known to mankind, I think is how it was described, the A3640, which is not a particularly fast 040 card. It lacks RAM or any form of L2 cache on it, or directly on the processor card. It's all accessed through the SIM slots on the motherboard, which means it's a bit slow compared to some other 040 and 060 cards that are out there. And yeah, that's essentially what became the Amiga 4000. In doing so, obviously, corners were cut, the SCSI was removed, there was no DSP, as I say, there was no built-in flicker fixer, but we did at least get the upgrade to Zorro 3 over the original Amiga 2200/2400 design, which was mostly caused by a bug, I believe, as opposed to a design choice. But there you have it. So eventually this was cobbled into the Amiga 4000 design, dropping the dual 3.5-inch bays for 5.25 and 2 3.5-inch bays, external faciness with an internal 3.5-inch bay, making for a very busy Amiga in terms of space, but there it was. And thankfully, because of AGA, it did at least have something going for it. But it was a real shame that in terms of hardest access speeds, we lost the speed of the SCSI interface that was in the Amiga 3000, plus the versatility of that external SCSI interface. And another downside was that due to AGA, and potentially also the 040, I'm not 100% clear on that, other people are more knowledgeable, but Commodore's SCSI cards, for example the A2091, were never really fully compatible with the Amiga 4000. You know, you had to do a few workarounds. You know, they might be a bit slower than they should have been, and therefore, you know, for a while there wasn't a decent SCSI controller for the Amiga 4000. This was quite important because a lot of peripherals that were external for the Amiga were very much SCSI based, because that was kind of what had been set as the precedent, you know, way back when kind of thing for the Amiga. And at the time, SCSI was a good way of doing this. I mean, IBM PC compatibles did have parallel port accessories, but the Macintosh and the Amiga tended to focus on SCSI-based peripherals for CD-ROM, scanners, that kind of thing, external hard disks, for example. And it was much better than, obviously, using parallel ports, which were much slower. So that was a downgrade, and of course, obviously, as I say, the flicker fixer was missing, so the PAL and NTSC screen modes would flicker on a 15 kHz display. You couldn't display them at all on a 31 kHz VGA style monitor, but AGA did at least have much better capabilities for potentially putting out 31 kHz signals. Unfortunately, not in all screen modes. Some of the double PAL and double NTSC screen modes sort of got to about 28.5 kHz from memory, maybe 29 kHz, which was just below VGA spec of 31.5 kHz, meaning that a lot of VGA monitors would not sink down low enough to catch the picture, essentially. For example, I had a Fujitsu 14-inch VGA monitor on my Amiga 1200, and it would only display using the VGA only monitor driver, so not a massive issue at the time, but it was there nonetheless. So yeah, a bit of a downgrade on that front. But yeah, otherwise it was a reasonable enough upgrade for the Amiga, but marketplace wise, getting decidedly less competitive. 486s were really making inroads now on the PC side of things. In the UK, a 6 megabyte, 80 megabyte, I believe, or maybe it was a 210 megabyte hard drive. I'm a little bit fuzzy about the exact hard disk size specification, but the top end Amiga 4000 configuration was around about £2,000 in 1992, which was a lot of money and definitely well within 486 territory. So, looking back, we all know that in terms of longevity, software-wise and so forth, even though PCs were going through rapid iteration by this point, Pentium just around the corner, the 486 would have been a better option than the 4000 if you was looking to use it in an office situation, to be honest with you. Have Microsoft Office, all these kinds of things, Ball and C or Delphi, and all the other things to do with the rapidly dominant Microsoft ecosystem. Whatever you might think about it, that's how things panned out, isn't it? You can't deny what was happening in the marketplace at the time. So, but the Amiga 4000 did at least have a bit of a niche because NewTek had the video toaster. And really, when it comes to big box Amigas, the video toaster, as I've said before, was the thing that gave the Amiga a true unique business case. Something that, like the Macintosh and the PC just at the time were not really best suited to doing. It was beginning to happen. Like I've said in previous videos, I've listened to loads of interviews from various skate industry filmers and so forth that around this time were beginning to dabble with personal computer-based video editing, and so Avid and so forth was beginning to creep in. You had some various Macintosh-based solutions as well, because at the time you had the Macintosh Quadra series. Some of those had the AV models, which allowed for recording from various AV sources. So video editing was beginning to creep in around about 1993 onto PCs and Macintoshes as well. Probably not as slick and as integrated as a video toaster. Probably not broadcast quality, but for producing VHS, this was beginning to happen. It was, that the Amiga's, one single unique thing that it could do that the other systems couldn't do was just at the very beginning of being chipped away at. So the video toaster was really the thing that made that the Amiga 4000 had a reason for being in certain situations for public broadcast TV stations in the US. And the Amiga 4000 was the Amiga in tandem with the video toaster that began to make a very tiny imprint in Japan as well, being as both the US or North America and Japan share the NTSC standard, so for video broadcast. So, the 4000 was not a complete and abject failure that you might sometimes hear about. And I feel that this is the reason I put it in at number 3, above and beyond, say, the 1000 and the 3000. First of all, you don't actually need to do case modifications to a 4000 to fit a video toaster in. It's going to get cramped, and you're probably going to need some external, sort of drive space, potentially for actual spinning hard disks. But you can use SD cards these days, obviously, or whatever appropriate SCSI to SD solutions. But you could get a working video toaster system, video toaster flyer system working in a 4000. You'll be able to use the full capabilities of it because you've got AGA, and yeah, you're limited to standard definition video creation. But as Ant Jarvis on the Amiga show has shown, I still think it's a fabulously interesting thing that you can still use in 2023. And I feel that for somebody who is going to lay down maybe a couple of grand on a system, Amiga 3000, Amiga 4000, these days I feel that the Amiga 4000 wins out. And I think it's a real key reason to potentially consider an Amiga 4000 over the two all-in-one wedge Amigas that I've yet to speak about. It's the one thing that I feel, yeah, it still has some merit to. And, you know, other real amazing Amiga creatives are using Amigas for sound editing and so forth. So the person who always comes to mind with this is Paulie Alex Bow, who's Vogue Reneg on YouTube. She just creates amazing music, and admittedly she's using an Amiga 3000. She mentioned in that particular video how much joy that machine brings to her and so forth, so which is really awesome. But the kinds of things that she is doing you could also do with an Amiga 4000, and I think the price differential is not that vast between Amiga 3000s and 4000s. Different matter with the tower, although Amiga 3000Ts are expensive, but I think, you know, for me, if I was like, no, I want to get a 16-bit sound card, I want to potentially create a video toaster system, or maybe use something exotic like a, what is it, the Macromedia? Is it Macromedia? No, surely that's the company Adobe bought. The what was the name of that company? Macro System. You got the Macro System VLab. It's not the original one. I can't remember what the next card that they released is called, but there's sort of maybe it's the VLab Motion, and so that would record MJPEG into the Amiga. So, you know, I feel that with all the things that potentially we could still use an Amiga for these days, Scala, these kinds of things, I would rather put the money down on an Amiga 4000 today than a 3000. I mean, I'm not in the market for either, but that's my thinking. They share the same processor cards, and you can work around the Amiga 4000's at-launch issues, such as the slow IDE with another card, you know, sort of in a Zorro slot. You don't necessarily have to worry too much about the flicker fixer situation these days. You know, you could use a compatible LCD monitor that can sync down to 15 kilohertz, potentially allowing all screens to come through, or you can use some other kind of upscaling solution to solve that issue these days, as we're not all plugging in VGA sort of style CRT monitors onto our systems these days. So that's some of my reasoning of why I've put the 4000 above the 3000. So I want to touch on the 4000T. So this is this machine. Commodore only produced about a couple of hundred of these, so they're exceedingly rare, and they go for a pretty penny, to say the least. Amiga Technologies then went on to produce them as well, offering some of them with an 060 processor. But beyond the Amiga 4000, they are very similar. They still have the same built-in 2 megabytes of chip RAM on a SIM card, plus up to 16 megabytes on the motherboard itself through SIM cards. 72-pin SIM cards, not the ones you put in your phone. And you've got more Zorro free slots than you have on a Amiga 4000. You also have 2 video slots on these, which is interesting. And probably most importantly, this provides the equivalent of an A4091 SCSI 2 controller on the motherboard, as well as IDE, which is interesting. So you can have fast hard disk access, all these kinds of things. So some people would say you should really separate out the 4000 from the 4000T in this ranking, because, you know, they're different enough to merit it. I'm not so sure. Making 12 videos is enough for me as it is, and I wanted to keep this series relatively straightforward, although you could argue I have talked about the 1500, the 2500 and the 2000. But hey, it was meant to originally be the 12 days of Amiga, you know, to riff on the Christmas scene. But we all know how that worked out, because it's now mid-February. So, yeah, just if you want to separate them out and do your own videos, please be my guest. But for my videos, this is what I've done. But yeah, it's largely you know, the same kind of stuff that you had on your Amiga 4000, with a lot more internal expansion capability and so forth. But the reason the 4000T is interesting is not just because Amiga Technologies then picked it up for manufacturing and put them out in greater numbers, but when Amiga Technologies went bust, eventually it was sold to Gateway 2000, as they were at the time, and the Amiga technology was licensed out to a company called QuickPack, who I believe, now I could be wrong about this, but I believe that they were doing the manufacture of the Amiga 4000T for Amiga Technologies anyway, before all of that went bust. And the reason for this is that they were putting together systems, video toaster systems, for these public broadcast channels and so forth, and other people who wanted to create broadcast quality productions. And even, 1996, 1997, even into 1998, the video toaster was still a very viable option. Definitely on its way out by that kind of stage, 1998 or so, but people were still buying these. So from QuickPack's point of view, manufacturing Amiga 4000Ts still had a purpose, and some of these Amiga 4000Ts were supplied with a much faster 060 card with much greater amounts of RAM and so forth, and much bigger hard disks than the Amiga 4000 was originally supplied with from Commodore. So the Amiga 4000T had quite an extended lifespan. So you will see slightly different variants of the Amiga 4000T out there in the wild. I think they're all pretty expensive these days, but they are out there. So so there's the Amiga 4000, folks. I just want to finish up with some of my own personal experiences with the 4000, because this is a machine that I didn't strictly own, but for about a year somebody basically loaned me their Amiga 4000 in 1999 through to the year 2000 to look after and make use of, because they had gone to a PC and they, for some reason, didn't want to sell it straight away. Never really knew why, but... So I had this Amiga 4000. It had an 060, I think it was an Apollo 4060 card in there, and a Picasso 4 graphics card and a CD-ROM drive, all within sort of the desktop case. And concurrent to this, I had the Amiga 3000 and also my 1200 tower. 1200 that I put into a tower. And the 4000 was fantastic. I mean, that 060 just made this thing fly. Using PageStream in 1999 on this beautiful Amiga 4000 with these lovely 1024 by 768 screen modes. It was really fast, really fast. I mean, okay, maybe not as fast as the fastest Pentium PC out there, but for an Amiga, it really flew. It made using applications like Photogenics, PageStream, Draw Studio, those caliber of applications they just flew along. The Picasso 4 graphics card obviously circumvented the slowness of AGA. You could play Doom as fast as you like on this. It wasn't fast enough to play Quake at a decent frame rate, but nonetheless, fantastic system. And I have fond memories of using that machine for about a year. I think it was still using the IDE hard disk in the system, but I guess maybe just the brute force speed of the 060 and the graphics card somehow meant that it always felt pretty fast to me. Certainly the fastest Amiga until I got the PPC card for the Amiga 1200T that I ever owned, and arguably faster because I had the 060, whereas my PPC card had an 040 processor. So really nice system. Would I buy one these days? No, because I don't fit that category of user that I've been talking about that might be doing video toaster stuff or music production. But for other people, if you are wanting to do all that kind of stuff on Amiga beyond the Paula chip and so forth, beyond just using a simple Genlock, then yeah, this is possibly where I would spend the money. There may be some argument for an Amiga 2000 with a Vampire card, I guess. Ant Jarvis is one of those with his Amiga show. But some of the video toaster stuff, you can get the best out of the Video Toaster 4000 with AGA. So that's kind of why I've put it here, really, because really that's where I can see the main use cases for a big box Amiga in 2023. But you're free to agree or disagree with me, as always, in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Do you own an Amiga 4000, and what do you think? What do you use it for? Or did you used to use one, and did you regret buying it compared to a PC or a Macintosh in a day? Or perhaps, thought it was fantastic. I'd love to continue the discussion with you all in the comments down below. But otherwise, I guess that's it for this one. And all that remains for me to say is see you soon. Peace.